Welcome to Happy Writing, your podcast home for taking positive steps forward with your author business. I'm your host and happy writer-in-chief, Dionne Abulela. Today's episode is sponsored by author Leslie Hauser and her debut novel, Chasing Evelyn. Chasing Evelyn is a heartwarming look at two best friends as they seek to reunite the favorite band of Ivy's missing mother. Will they have to go all the way to Ireland to make Ivy's dreams come true? And will reuniting the band bring Ivy's mother back? You can find the answers for yourself by picking up Chasing Evelyn at your favorite bookstore. But to make it easy for you, we've dropped the links down in the podcast description. You're ready to go? We're ready to go. Hello, happy writers, and welcome to the Happy Writing Podcast. This is your host and happy writer-in-chief, Dionne Abulela, coming to you today with another great author that I know you are going to love. Today's author started her novel over 12 years ago, and like many of us have experienced, when she first started it, the words didn't flow quite how she wanted. Eventually, she tucked those pages away, but if you fast forward to 2019, today's author decided she was not giving up on that story that just sat inside of her head. She had the urge to really get the story out, and eventually it reemerged. She came to us with a new process, a new outlook, and eventually an entirely new book. And by new book, I do mean a fresh, new little book baby of only 3 weeks. So please welcome the author of Widow's Lace, Lelita Baldock, to our podcast today. How are you doing?
Very well, Dionne, and thank you for having me. This is really good to be able to have a chat with somebody else about writing and about authors. It's a fabulous thing, so thank you.
You are so welcome. And, it's great to just get out of our little norm right now.
Yeah, very much.
Now, I know a little bit about how Widow's Lace came to you, but kind of walk us through that journey, because I know a lot of authors have story nuggets that have sat in their head for a while, and they've started them and tucked them away and came back to them. And you're one of the few who did this successfully. So if you don't mind, Lelita, could you walk me through that journey of Widow's Lace?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for me, a large part of the writing process really does come from locations and settings. So I often find that when I'm traveling or if I'm in a new location, something about that sort of, I guess, being somewhere different will inspire me, which is exactly what happened with Widow's Lace. So I think it was about, 12 years ago. I was on a family trip up the Finniss River in South Australia. So it's kind of a holiday area of South Australia, but it's only quite small, so not a large population of people there except during the holiday time. And we took a boat trip up the Finniss River. It's just a little tributary river that comes off of the Murray, effectively. And it was just so peaceful and quiet there, I think. The whole kind of, there's just gum trees and reeds in the river, and you could only hear the birds and the insects. And the feeling of how remote that was really sort of hit me, I think, and got my brain thinking about, years ago when the area was first settled, what was it like for people living there, being so isolated, and this image of a person standing by the river by themselves, just, living in a way on that river away from everyone else in society kind of really came to me. And then that whole idea about why would someone be there by themselves kind of grew. So the idea came from that kind of catalyst, a sense of, what would, inspire someone to live in a remote place by themselves. And then over the next kind of, 6 months, that idea just sort of teased in my head. And I was at university at the time and reading a lot of Gothic literature. So ideas of isolation and fear and that sort of thing was really quite prevalent in my mind at the time. So I think that really fed my thinking on the whole topic. So eventually I actually got my A into G and sat down and plotted out a story idea, and I wrote my first version, which was about 150 words long. And I think really, I think I had the ideas of what I was trying to say, but I didn't know how to actually effectively convey it, I suppose, how to put it into a good story or something that someone would want to read. A lot of it was too much background information, I think, that could then just be condensed into a sentence. So I think I was definitely overwriting. Um, and then I think life just happened, and we moved to the UK. We moved back to Australia, and my husband and I, and then we moved here again to the UK, which is where I am now. And I think we had this real idea that we wanted, both of us, to get back into our personal passions and things we wanted to try and do. And I think Widow's Lace had always sat there in the background. You know, I had this manuscript, I had this idea. I liked the idea, I liked what I was trying to do with it, but I just hadn't at the time been able to pull it together. But I think those interim years of maturing and reading more widely myself, when I came to sit down about 18 months ago and rework the manuscript, I found it flowed much easier. And I think a large part of that was partly actually because of the time I'd already invested in really creating my characters and my storyline. So the overwriting, whilst is not a good thing for what you actually want to publish at the end, did allow me to have a really strong idea of where I wanted to take the story and how I wanted to use the characters. So I took that foundation that I had created about 12 years ago and rewrote it. And now I have Widow's Lace, which I'm really proud of.
It's so great. And I know a lot of authors fall into that as well, where they sit down and they start to write and it doesn't come exactly how they thought it was going to. So they give up. And that's okay. It may come back to you later, as long as, we just don't give up immediately, because those first words aren't always great.
No, and I think that's a large part of it. I actually read a quote by Terry Pratchett. He said that the first draft of a novel is you telling yourself the story. And that really resonates with me, because I think that's very much at least how I work. I like to plan it a lot. I like to write out notes and have an idea of, all my characters and an idea of my chapters. But when I come to writing it, I think, no matter how much you've planned it, you are still discovering it yourself that first time. And I think it's, I guess, okay to be doing that, to be discovering it yourself. You don't have to get it perfect the first time. You're allowed to take that time and that growth with what you're doing.
Absolutely. And that's kind of what writing is all about. It's discovery. And so I like how you said that at this time while you were progressing, it was not only this idea, but then kind of the impact of some of the Gothic literature and other things that kind of evolved over time. How did your writing style, did you notice a big style change even from then to now?
I think so. I think I was much more. So at the time when I first wrote it, I suppose for context, I was working as an English teacher. And so I think I was very much in that more academic style of writing, so analysing and helping my students to write essays. So that's quite a different style of writing to something creative.
Mhm.
So a lot of what came out in the first manuscript really was more like, I guess, paragraphs of detail rather than paragraphs of description. And then I would find myself trying to write something very descriptive, but it was overwritten. I was sort of trying to use too many adjectives, trying to, I had a vision in my head of what I was trying to describe, but the words, I guess I was overwriting is really the best way I can look at it. But then, in the interim years, reading more widely myself and practicing just writing short stories and things, I guess I developed that skill to be more aware of, well, what am I actually trying to say here? What am I actually trying to describe? Can I condense it down into a sentence or two to make that sort of more impacting and clearer for a reader? So I think my style became more succinct, but in doing that, it didn't become more clipped, which I suppose would be possible, but I think it actually became much more descriptive by being more succinct.
It's so funny because I was yeah, I was just talking about this with another author that we interviewed just I did 3 interviews yesterday, taking advantage of quarantine
Big
time.
day.
So, yeah. So I don't know if it'll be the episode right before this or 2 before this, but we had this exact same conversation where we both felt like to be an author meant we had to look at the, like blue sky and write like 7 pages of adjectives to just describe
Yes.
blue. And sometimes learning how to be succinct in itself is powerful. And so that
Yeah.
was a good, well, it is a good lesson, but it's something that I still struggle with
Oh
myself.
no, and I don't think it's an easy skill to have at all. And
Yeah.
I would say I've mastered it, but it is something I think I've learned to really appreciate when you read. When you read something and you're like, oh, that really speaks to me. I'm really enjoying that. I think more often than not, you realize it's actually because it's just so clearly expressed. So I guess it just draws you into it easier. You don't have to do any work as a reader to understand what they're trying to convey. And I think, yeah, it's certainly something I plan to keep working on as I continue writing.
Do you think that you read differently now that you're writing?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think I do. I think I'm more conscious of what I'm taking on. I think probably I did that always to a level because of having studied English and then teaching it. So
Mhm.
a large part of when you're learning and when you're teaching English is to look at what is an author doing, author's craft, it's often called. So, and my students laugh at that. What skills are they using? What different crafts are they using? So metaphors and similes and things like that. But also the style and the use of vernacular. And so I think I've always looked at novels that way, definitely. But that's a much more analytical approach. Whereas now I think I look at that still because I really appreciate those crafts.
Mhm.
But I think I'm more aware of the flow of the words and I guess the voice. And I know I have a bit of a pet peeve with the term voice because I know it's the right description of how an author writes their voice. I just find it so vague sometimes. I'm not quite sure how to interpret it when people talk about it, but it is the right expression because it is that feeling that you get when you're reading something. And I think a
Yeah.
lot of that has to do with how an author's words flow um, and their use of description. So I think more and more I'm appreciating that. And when I'm reading something and I'm drawn into it, I stop and go, not just well, what descriptions am I enjoying, but also well, why am I drawn into that character and the way that that's written and the voice that's being used, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, it does. And I'm shocked that I've never asked anyone that question before.
No,
But
it's a good one. It's a really good
yeah,
question.
for some reason, like we're talking about getting things more succinct. And I'm also a university professor, but I teach social media marketing. So my students are also like, listen, I don't want to know how authors do social media. But I'm always like, no, it's so good. Especially like if you want to kill it on social media, follow a romance author. They
Yes.
they do it. Um, and I never thought to ask somebody if getting into the craft has changed the way that they read other people's
Mm.
before, but it's so interesting. Um, you are a brand new author with a 3-week-old little newborn book baby. Has it what self-publishing is such a fun world, and I think we always go into it with certain expectations or um, being surprised by little challenges or big successes. What has been your biggest surprise so far with your publishing journey?
In all honesty, I think the fact that it was quite easy to do in the first
Mhm.
place. So obviously, at this point, my book's only been out for 3 weeks, so there's still a long way to go with promotion and things like that. But actually setting it up and getting it out there, I've done it through Amazon simply because it's affordable to do. But the actual process wasn't challenging. Once you've written it, obviously, and edited it and got it to the level that you're happy with, which is challenging. But the actual process of putting it into the world for people to access was something I actually found quite easy to do. And I really thank my husband for that. It was his idea. I was very much like, oh, what can I do? How can I get this out there? And he was the one who said, well, look, why don't you self-publish and look into that? And it isn't a difficult process once you've got your manuscript and you're confident with it. And I think that's a good thing to know. It isn't. a massive hindrance like it may have been, 20 years ago before we had those sorts of ebook online selling programs and things like that. Yeah.
I mean, what a great time we live in where we can really take charge of our own kind of destiny as authors. And we have the option to go with those that have been in the industry and are professionals and, nurture the commercial aspects, or we have the choice to really take charge of our future and welcome the challenges and the struggles and the beautiful days that come with it as well.
I
Some
absolutely agree. Yeah. Sorry, please go on.
Yeah, no, you're fine. You're fine. I was just thinking that, there's some days as an author where I think, oh, should I query this next one? Should I query this one? And at the
Mm.
end of the day, I still keep coming back to wanting to remain self-published because I like that control. And then maybe one day I'll branch out, I mean, you
Yeah.
never know.
Well,
But
no. I absolutely agree with that. I think,
yeah.
12 years ago when I was first writing my novel, I would never have even dreamed of the idea of self-publishing. Um, but once you actually sort of look into it and look into, I think, talking about control is a huge part of it. Like, and I think personally for me, I quite enjoy a challenge. So the challenge of learning about social media and how to promote my book, it doesn't come naturally to me to self-promote. That's a new skill I'm working on, but that's all part of the kind of, I guess, the journey and the fun of it. And you've extended yourself in the first place, writing a novel and putting yourself out there, and now you're taking it the next level and actually learning how to promote it to the world. And I think that's a different skill, but an equally enjoyable thing to sort of discover, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, it does. And it kind of takes me to my next point with your journey, and that is that you're motivated to not only learn the different avenues and find pieces that maybe you're not the most comfortable with, like self promotion, and overcome those and do them in a way that's still true to yourself, but you also took an idea that was 12 years old, sat down last year and said, okay, we're going to do this, planned it out, got it out, and you stayed motivated. And a lot of authors trip over that motivation in different aspects. Which one for you do you think is most challenging? The motivation to write or the motivation to follow up after your book's been published and keep growing?
Ooh. See, this no, I like this. I
I
like
love
these
that
questions
response.
that make me pause and think. Um, I don't know that I would say. I mean, originally, I think the motivation to keep writing was a challenge, hence the 12-year break.
Mhm.
But I think that I've come to a point in my life now where I've learned that motivation is it might be something that sparks your interest and sits you down in front of a computer to start with, but ultimately what actually gets you writing every day or doing work on self promotion every day, it really isn't motivation. You have an overarching idea, of course, and that is a bigger picture that you're working towards. But ultimately, you have to just, I guess, decide that you're going to put this time aside and you're going to do these steps. And so I think in a lot of ways, I don't rely on motivation. I because that's a very internal thing to do. I think I more externalize it and make it something that I'm planning to do. So I think I sit down, I'll write myself a list, I'll have a plan of when I'm going to write or what I'm going to try doing in promotion, and I make that like an appointment, effectively, that I have to keep. And so if I wake up and I'm just not really in the mood for it, that's not a choice. That's what you have to do.
Mhm.
And so I think that that's very much driven by sort of externally forcing myself to do that. But I guess ultimately at the end of the day, there is still that bigger picture of what I'd like to achieve that remains there as a little motivation that comes from within as well. So I think that, yeah, I think motivation can be a tricky one. And it is important, I think, to externalize that so you're not just relying on yourself to be in the mood. Um,
Mm.
but I think that ultimately, to your question, probably I do find the self promotion a little harder to stick to. But I think that's mostly because it's the new thing I'm learning about. I'm not as confident, and also because I'm putting myself out there in a way I'm not used to. Whereas writing, I guess, when you're motivating yourself to do that, you're still very much in your own little cocoon, People aren't looking at you and judging you when you're doing it. So it's not as scary to actually take those steps initially, I think.
What do you think your biggest challenge with the self-publishing process has been? Has it been figuring out how to self-promote? Because I like you, I felt like once my book was finished, getting it onto the market for me was relatively easy. And I know a lot of authors that struggle with that step, and then a lot of authors struggle with the writing, and a lot of authors struggle with the self-promotion. But what part of your process or what you're going through right now, whether it's like a specific part of motivation or not motivation, gosh, I'm stuck on that word.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Look, motivation is important. I can understand.
Yeah. Uh, I don't even remember what the question was now.
We're talking about what I have found most challenging with
Yeah.
self-publishing, yeah, which I think in your question and leading into it very much is the self-promotion side of it. I think actually getting your book onto a platform is relatively easy now, but then actually finding a way so that people know you exist and that you're out there. Is something I'm definitely learning about, and I have found it challenging. I think social media is fantastic as a platform, but learning how to use it well is an extra challenge. I think I'm only new to things like Twitter and Instagram, and I actually find Instagram quite enjoyable. There's quite a lovely little community of independent writers there, and that's been sort of fun to share ideas. I've found Twitter to be quite an interesting beast. I've never used it before, but I am finding it to be a very useful tool. So I think it's really about researching it and trying new ideas. And I'm still a fledgling at that, but that's okay. A challenge is good.
Yeah, absolutely. All challenges, growth and giving us a new set of tools. And it kind of, everything is a process. And whether it's your writing and you're developing an idea and, bringing it to life, or whether it's your marketing and you're developing an idea and bringing it to life, it's all the process of it. And do you think that your process now that you're published in any way mirrors the steps that you went through writing, or are you trying to find a new process to explore kind of the marketing and post-publishing side?
Yeah, I see it quite differently, I think. I think because with the process of learning to write, it was something that happened over several years, and some of it was quite, I guess, not even conscious. You absorb writing if you read. So if you're a person, and I love to read, I'm always have a book going, and so I think that a lot of that learning is quite subconscious when you're doing a lot of when you're reading a lot, and then when you're actually practicing writing again, you're actively doing it, but then there's a subconscious learning that happens at the same time. I think with creativity, your brain kind of makes those connections on its own, whereas I find the process of learning how to self-publish and self-promote to be very much more like learning learning a skill that requires steps and structure, and I don't feel that it comes to me naturally, or that I subconsciously pick things up at all. I feel that it's something I very much need to read blog posts, take notes, and then actively action certain tasks. So I think I feel they're quite different, but I suspect that's because I have a background of a lot of work in literature and reading. So that's a certain mindset I think I naturally go towards, whereas more marketing and sort of business is not something I've ever studied or ever really spent much time on. So it's quite a different headspace.
Yeah, they are. They are. Absolutely. And I love hearing the different ways that authors approach their platform, whether that's writing or whether that's the marketing and kind of how they do it, because part of the reason we're bringing this out is I really want authors to realize that all authors are different. And you guys, if you're on the podcast, you might be able to hear Ramona snoring, my dog snoring in the background. She's kind of a staple on it, but she is really going for it today. So.
That's lovely. It's the best sound, isn't it? When my cat snores, I just feel like everything's right in the world.
Yeah, she just looks so happy, but she's really going for it today. So that's what's in the background, not me. So, but I really want authors to realize that it's okay to just be your own person. And so another thing that we're doing is bringing out little kind of unknown facts about authors too. And you recently just had your first nachos.
I did, which I know is a shock at 37 years old that I finally discovered the absolute deliciousness that is nachos. Yes, I will not look back now. They're going to be a staple snack for me when I feel the need for some crunch and some salt.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, no, they were just not something I came across as a child. I don't think Mexican food was particularly big, or that style of food was particularly big in Australia when I was a child. But also, my dad didn't like things that were crunchy or sort of spicy. So, but yeah, no, my husband likes them, and he suggested we try making some at home, and yeah, that was an eye opener for me.
Welcome to the good life.
Oh yeah, no, very much so, very much so.
That is my comfort food. So when you put that on Twitter, I was like, I don't care if this is the worst interview ever, which it's not, by the way. I have to get you on the show just to talk about the
No, I know it
situation.
was one of those things. Your question, what is something interesting about you? And I was like, oh, I don't know. And I turned to my husband, and he goes, hello, you've only just had nachos. And I was like, oh yeah, that's probably a really good point.
Like I thought about that all day. Like, what would my life be like without nachos?
Honestly, I'm not sure how I managed it. Now that I've discovered them, it's
Oh,
it's much more pleasant. I think I love some salty crunch, so it's the perfect comfort food. I totally agree.
I'm so proud of you. I
Thank
have our last question today before I let you tell the authors how they can find you. This is a loaded one, so prepare yourself.
you. Okay.
Lelita, what is your favorite book or what author has influenced you the most?
I think I have to go with, and it is an unusual one because I'm not a fantasy literature writer, but I love fantasy literature. So I'm going to go with Robin Hobb.
Hmm.
I think she's absolutely brilliant. I which book? Her books are all like series of trilogies, but it's in the same universe and following the same characters. So I think I'd go with the Farseer trilogy, the first book from the Farseer trilogy. Um, Assassin's Apprentice. I love how she writes. I love the universe she's created. As I said before, I love settings. So the world of her books is something I really love delving into. So that would be my answer.
I love that. I love hearing what different authors read and what inspires them because, like you, I have recently really come to love the fantasy
Mm,
genre and I've gotten so wrapped up in these rich worlds that authors create, even though
yes,
it's not in my wheelhouse. And I don't think I'd ever write fantasy. Like I would love to. I have an idea for kind of a young adult fantasy trilogy, but I don't know if I'm brave enough to tackle a book with the amount of skill that these authors have. They're absolutely magnificent in the way that they create these books.
I so agree. And it is that, I think setting is so important in any story because it creates that sense of authenticity. But if you're trying to do that in a fictional world that you've invented, the skill I think that they come up with and the little details that just give it that real sense of you could believe it was a real place. It's subtle, but it's really effective, and I find that something I really enjoy. So I'm much like you. I discovered fantasy literature maybe 8 years ago, so a bit longer ago than you, but I'm an utter convert. I
Yeah.
read a lot of it now.
It's amazing. I know that there are people who are going to be listening to this podcast that want to find out more about you, or maybe want to talk to you more about how they can regain their motivation and maybe restart a project that they've struggled with, or just talk to you about something you said on this show that they connect with. Where
Absolutely.
on the internet can our listeners find you?
So I have a website. It's my name, lelitabaldock.com. And my email address and contact details are all there. And I absolutely love hearing from people, any questions they might have about writing or motivation, or even if they just want to bounce an idea off. I think the whole world of writing is such a fabulous place, and
Mhm.
supporting each other with ideas and sort of the growth of that as a world is fantastic. So please get in contact, get in touch if you have anything you'd like to discuss.
100%. We all win together and we work together. So if you have been listening and you do want to get in touch with Lelita, ooh, had a heavy mouth there. If you, well, edit that part out. If you have been listening,
Just need a glass of water.
yeah. How this happens. This was the first time I was like, we made it through the whole podcast without having to edit anything so far. Nope. Um, if you have been listening and you do want to get a hold of Lelita, but you're not able to write it down at the moment, don't worry. Go back to where you found the podcast, whether that's our website, our blog, our podcast page, or our social medias, or my social media. They're on Twitter at I'm a Happy Writer. Then all of the information for how you can find her will be in the podcast description. So do not worry. We will make sure that you can not only get a hold of her, but also find a link to buy her book and a link to the author that she loves. So thank you all so much for joining us today and listening to another lovely author telling us about their process. And Lelita, thank you so much for all of your time today.
Thank you very much for having me on. I've really enjoyed this chat. It's been fabulous.